This decade turned Iron Man's series from a dud to a stud. There's one creative team responsible for that. Let's talk about it. Iron Man's creative team during this time consisted of writer David Michelinie, penciler John Romita Jr., and writer-artist Bob Layton.
I hated Iron Man as a kid. I tell this when I do one of my lectures or whatever, or one of my master classes, I said, just remember the hate is a good thing if you channel it properly. Because if anyone has read the original Tales of Suspense, which Stan never actually wrote, he handed it off to his brother Larry, who was not Stan Lee. Let's face it. Okay, the early Iron Mans were just abominable, and the book always struggled. There were two tiers at Marvel. There was like the A books, the Avengers, Thor, Spider-Man, and then there was the stuff people wrote to pay the rent, and that was always Iron Man. Iron Man was always kind of a hand-me-down character, redheaded stepchild, whatever you want to call it, right? So the process of Iron Man was the fact that I always had a bug in my ass about what it should be like. And first of all, as a kid, we go back to Turbo again, right? I didn't want to be Iron Man. My fantasy was to be Tony Stark. My fantasy was to have all the girls, be the best looking guy in the room with all the girls, all the money, all the toys, right? And an empire of my own, right? So to me, that seemed like a more achievable fantasy than putting on a suit of armor and flying around all over the place, right? And as you know, it was always the trope where, Oliver Queen or Batman or whatever, they all millionaires, so they could afford to do this stuff. So it was always just a means to get them into the costume and do the comic book adventures. But I looked at it more being fashion conscious and girl conscious and all this kind of stuff. I said, Tony Stark should be a rock star. He should walk into a room, and it should be, people should lose their minds, when he walks in, right? Not so much Iron Man, but him is more popular than Iron Man. So that was my kind of goal. But if I ever got my hands on it, I said that I would change the focus of the characters. Fortunately, David Michelinie, who we were working together at DC before we jumped over and picked up the reins on Iron Man, was a DC guy. He wasn't much of a Marvel reader, so he had no background with that character, so he had no preconceived notions of it. I think that's one of the reasons why it really worked, because when we came in, we had a totally fresh approach. We killed the Animan in like page 5 of our first issue. So we got to get rid of the Doggy Man and the Kitty Man and all this stuff, and you get some real villains in there. So the whole idea was to totally revamp the book, because they gave us carte blanche. When we came over, it was a tryout book. They tried us out because the book was going to be canceled, and that's how they tried out new talent, was on books, because the newsstands, they work 6 months ahead, so they knew when the sales were coming back, if a book reached a certain level, that they were going to access. So Iron Man was on the chopping block, so they take their A-list guys off and then put schmucks like us on. So they gave us a choice of 3 books, and I convinced Dave, let's do Iron Man. Trust me, I have ideas, right? So off we went, and we pretty much asked them, can we change stuff? And they're like, we don't care, we're canceling the book. But the nice thing is I inherited John Romita Jr., who became one of my favorite people to work with over the last 50 years. So it's getting Johnny in the deal was a good thing, definitely, and the beginning of a real long friendship. So there was an energy there because John was just starting. It was his second issue when we came on, and Dave was brand new to Marvel. I had been there. I had banged around. I did the Champions before, and I did one issue of the X-Men and then quit because the book was bi-monthly. I couldn't make a living doing it. And it's like, so yeah, I did stuff the first time, but back then the pay rate was so low, you just bounced to whoever was going to pay you $5 more a page. But when DC imploded in 70, I think it was 77, when they had their big implosion or whatever, I convinced Dave, we were working on Star Hunters at the time, at DC. I said, I know people at Marvel. Let's go over there as a team and just pitch ourselves as a team. And that's kind of how we wound up on the Iron Man. And the rest, as they say, is history. 6 months later, it was one of their best-selling titles, and off we go.
One of Layton's mentors was artist and editor Dick Giordano, who showed him the ropes of the industry.
And poor Woody, not to say anything disparaging, but Dick Giordano was my idol, okay, in every way imaginable. Woody, I mean, the first comic I ever read was a Wally Wood comic, so that was pretty awesome in itself. But Woody wasn't quite the teacher that Dickie was. Dickie understood the business of comics as well, and that's where I learned a lot of my acumen in terms of business was from Dick Giordano. So I went to work at Continuity, working for Dickie, going into the office 2 or 3 times a week, on the train from Stanford. So it was so I had 2 of the best mentors that you could ever ask for. There were wonderful people at Continuity like Russ Heath and Jack Abel, a lot of guys that, but you could always pick their brain. Larry Hama was there. You could always pick their brains.
The real meat of this run starts with issue 120, the start of the Demon in a Bottle arc.
When you were doing Demon in a Bottle, like I thought that was like a comic that came out like in the mid 80s when they start talking about comics got dark or whatever, but it was the 70s. It was like, were you getting any pushback for doing that story?
Not a bit. In fact, it was the opposite. You got to remember what comics really are. Comics are a mirror of what's happening in society. Generally, we don't create trends, we exploit them. And right at that particular moment, the Betty Ford Clinic had opened up. And people were, for the first time in the late 70s, were talking about alcoholism and drug addiction openly. And part of changing Tony Stark's whole, lexicon, part of that was the monthly heart attack. That had to go. By the 70s, you could get a heart transplant. It made no sense that the smartest man in the world couldn't fix his own friggin' heart, right? So, and I said, it's got to go. And Dave and I talked about it. And we said, well, let's give him a corporate disease. This is something that happens to a lot of people under a lot of stress or whatever. They fall into drinking and drugs and that kind of thing. And given the fact that Tony has an obsessive compulsive behavior pattern anyway, it would kind of make sense. I had a lot, and I will confess to your audience, I had a drinking problem as well. So that thing came from the heart. At that time, I was struggling with drugs and alcohol as well. And it's like, because the more successful I got, the more I partied, dude. And so, I mean, I always said that it was a bit of a cry for help. But unlike any other thing that was done, that story continues to resonate. It's the only comic story that people in the real world know by title. You mentioned Demon in a Bottle. Civilians have heard it, but the amazing thing was anything we were told was don't screw it up. You get one shot at it, don't screw it up. So we built up to it over 12 issues, right?
This run introduces one of Tony's major villains. For people who are only familiar with this version of Justin Hammer, you're going to be in for a big surprise. Comics Hammer doesn't make jokes, he doesn't dance, he's Tony Stark without a soul. Probably what Tony would become if he didn't change his ways. He's depraved and calculating and frames Iron Man for murder while chain-smoking in his flying houseboat. Yeah, he's so rich and dastardly, he built a flying house. Think of the carbon emissions. The biggest differences between them are how Tony is willing to get his hands dirty, we see him MacGyvering weapons and gear while Hammer has others do his dirty work for him. There's also the detail that Hammer is the one who gives Tony's villains weapons and armor and pays their bail.
Okay, back then they didn't have emails or anything like that, so you got letters from fans. After Demon in a Bottle, bags of mail came, literal giant mail bags came in of mail from people, and some of them would have broken your heart, man. I mean, kids writing saying, I thought my dad was a bad guy, and I read this story, and I realized that he's sick, and I would try to get him help. I mean, things like this would just tear you apart. And since then, I mean, I've been like these unofficial spokesperson for sobriety in the comic industry. It follows me around everywhere. I myself have been sober, what, 36 years now, you know? So it's a good thing. And it continues. The legacy continues on. I mean, that story keeps getting reprinted. And even here in Korea, people have read that story, So uh, it was just, something that we really needed to do to get rid of the heart problem and to create a more complex character.
Demon in a Bottle is technically one issue, however each issue from 120 builds up to what pushes Tony over the edge. His run-ins with Hammer, having his suit hacked, causing him to murder a diplomat. Then there's dealing with public scrutiny and guilt, causing him to drink more. As he nears the edge, his butler Jarvis leaves rather than watch Tony drink himself to death. By the time the actual Demon issue rolls around, Tony is alone. It's just him in the suit, and wearing it makes things worse. In Michelinie's words, quote, "We all have our personal demons, whether they be obsessive-compulsive disorder, unreasonable phobias, or even a simple lack of confidence or belief in ourselves. And how we deal with those demons is often what defines us. Some say we made Tony Stark less of a hero by having him given to alcohol, but we think we showed him as more of a hero by what he ultimately did about it." Unquote. I love that this story doesn't glamorize Tony. He actually makes himself look like a fool. There's a scene where he's knocking a few back and he flies out a window. Scenes like this make his recovery more impactful. Tony isn't the only person who gets coverage in these stories. His supporting cast gets fleshed out. His love interest, Beth Cabe's past, gets uncovered. Tony's security chief, Vic Martinelli, gets an entire arc where he develops a vendetta against Whiplash. For some reason, Layton, Michelinie, and Romita decide to make Whiplash into a complete menace in issue 146. This guy busts into Martinelli's house, snuffs his dog, then goes to Stark International to fight Iron Man and burn his company down. Vic goes full-on John Wick on Whiplash. Everyone has their own thing going on. When stories focus on the fantastical element of Tony's world, it removes any relatability. Tony has to be surrounded by normal people who are just trying to pay their bills and live their lives. Yeah, Beth is a badass femme fatale, and Rhodey's a kick-ass pilot, but even they're pretty normal compared to Stark. His stories need characters like Mrs. Arbogast, Scott Lang, and Martinelli, people who aren't perfect. Iron Man becomes hollow when he's surrounded by super people. Took a while to get there, but someone decided it would be a good idea teaming up the genius metal dudes. Issue 149 to 150 gives us the classic Doomquest arc. Despite being a cool team-up, it focuses on Doom's quest to save his mother's soul from hell.
I used to draw cars too. I grew up as a car freak when I was young. And it just always killed me. It never looked like metal, But strangely enough, the story Doomquest, one of my most famous Iron Man stories, was something I drew as an 11-year-old kid. I did it on notebook paper, blue line notebook paper, and I drew this Iron Man and Doctor Doom in King, in the days of King Arthur. And one night when we were plotting, Dave and I were plotting, David Michelinie, for those that don't know, I brought it up. And he's like, "I love that." He goes, "We should do that," and it turned out to be like one of our, greatest hits. But yeah, it was something I came up with as an 11-year-old kid.
So sending Iron Man and Doom back in time to Camelot is a refreshing change of pace for the series, taking both characters out of their element. Tony and Victor are such ideal foils to each other. One of them looks to the future and the other preserves forgotten magic. Doom starts off the story by calling Iron Man lackey and errand boy, but ends up working with him. This story shows how Dr. Doom is capable of working with others, and he doesn't hate everyone. Doom has his own code of honor in this story and only wants to save his mother's soul, not wanting Iron Man to get in the way. While Doom is the #1 Reed Richards hater, he develops a lot of respect for Tony Stark, even though they often disagree. He respects Stark so much that decades later he would take over the Iron Man mantle while Tony was out of commission.
In the distant reaches of the universe, Far, far from planet Earth, an uninhabited spiral galaxy turns its everlasting pirouette in magnificent splendor, unseen by living eyes.
In 1984, Marvel decided to release its first major crossover, a massive story bringing together its most popular heroes and villains. It was like 12 issues of taking toys and smacking them together, which is essentially what it was. Here's the scoop in the words of then Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter. Quote, "The road that led to Marvel Superhero Secret Wars actually began when Kenner Toys licensed the DC Universe for a boys action figure line. Their competitor, Mattel, already had their He-Man action figure line, which was doing very well, but wanted to hedge the bet in case comic book character action figures became the rage. So they came to Marvel to talk about licensing our characters. One thing they demanded of us was an event, a special publication or series to help launch the toy line. I offered an idea that was suggested by a dozen or so correspondents, usually younger ones, in the fan mail every day. One big, epic story with all or many of the heroes and villains in it. Everyone agreed." Unquote. Mike Zeck would be the main artist for the series, and Layton would do some covers and fill-in issues. Shooter took it upon himself to write the event. Quote, "I was the company's designated keeper of franchises and the ordained absolute authority on the characters. All part of the job, at least back then. The writers could and did argue with me, and on some occasions talked me into their point of view regarding what Thor, Spider-Man, or the X-Men would do or say in a given situation. But ultimately, it was my call. That made things a little easier, and less bloody. And because I had the best overview of what was going on in all the titles, working closely with the line editors and writers, I was able to keep the continuity tight. And with their help, I think we managed to work in the things Mattel asked for in ways that made sense and enhanced the story." Unquote.
Where I called it the beginning of the end for superhero comics.
It was, in a way, it was huge. I mean, the first giant mega crossover. I mean, somebody was going to do it eventually, right? You know, and it's just, as Mike Zeck and I said, the one thing we learned, somebody asked us, we did a con together in the Philippines last year, last October, and we were down there, Mike and I were doing a panel together, and they said, is there one word of advice you can give us or about working on being working on Secret Wars? And we said, yeah, both of us said pretty much at the same time, yeah, don't work with Jim Shooter as a writer because he'll make you crazy. Because Jim was changing things constantly, and it was so insane to keep up, and we had to redraw. It was just such a monster project, and on top of that, I had the Mattel toys that I was designing as well for the Secret Wars thing.
In his book, Tony relapsed and was out of commission for a couple years. There was only one person qualified to take up the mantle. At the end of Iron Man 181, Rhodey, wearing the Iron Man armor, gets sent to Battle World. He comes back immediately in issue 182, so people who didn't read the crossover would have no idea what happened. It's a pretty big deal that Rhodey is the one wearing the suit in this huge crossover instead of Tony. This event is one of the reasons Rhodey becomes resentful towards Tony in future stories. Rhodey feels out of his depth. He's wrestling with self-doubt about wearing the armor and dealing with cosmic beings. Rhodey knows how to handle himself, but he's not equipped to be taking on Galactus. He just has to make it work, which is one of my favorite parts of his character.
It was history making, without a doubt. But it did start a chain reaction that I wish to God we could have stopped at some point, because then we got ad nauseum events, non-events, crazy shit that just went on. I mean, they're still doing it, they're still doing it. But yeah, it's almost like, would I go back in time and Terminator, the whole thing, to kill myself and Mike Zeck? Probably. But it still resonates. Man, there are Secret Wars fans all over the place, I mean, they're everywhere. I went to Mexico a few years ago, and they love Secret Wars. I was in Monterey, and that's like their biggest selling title down there. They love Secret Wars, right? I probably signed more of those than any place else. And when Zach and I made an appearance together in the Philippines, they went nuts, right? And it's like, of course, I told them that Mike enlisted in that war. I got drafted, and it was probably one of the most difficult projects in the world to work on. And I got drafted. Mike Zeck had a nervous breakdown at issue 3, and like he wasn't going to be able to keep up. And so I was on contract, and I did at the time I was working on Power Man and Iron Fist. Dennis Cowan and I were doing a revamp of Power Man and Iron Fist. We were going to do a relaunch, because he's a black belt, karate man, and he had some great ideas for it. So we were going to explore Power Man and Iron Fist. So I was working on developing a new series, and then Shooter pulls me off, saying, you got to come in and draw a few issues, give Mike a breather, and let him. So I got drafted. Because I was on contract, so I had to do whatever they told me to do. That's what happens when you're on a contract with a company. They can pull you off and tell you to, draw My Little Pony if that's what it comes down to, right? Not that My Little Pony would have been a lot easier to do. So I got drafted into the war, and I fought the good fight.
Secret Wars is a series that's held together by nostalgia rather than it being a strong story on its own. I get the appeal of it being Marvel's first massive crossover where fans got to see all these heroes and villains duking it out. There is a pretty cool scene where the Hulk is holding up some rubble while Reed Richards MacGyvers a way to save everyone using Iron Man's armor and Spider-Man's web shooters. Rhodey mostly shares scenes with Monica Rambeau, the second Captain Marvel, and Reed. Who can forget iconic moments like Iron Man's roller skates, Rhodes criticizing Human Torch's game, the Iron Man Mr. Fantastic rideshare. The scene where Mr. Fantastic finds out that Rhodes is wearing Iron Man's suit is set up to be a big deal, but they move on from it pretty quickly. It should have been a bigger deal than it was because there weren't that many characters from marginalized groups represented in comics anyway, especially in that time. It just feels like a superficial then everyone clapped moment. Rhodey even comments on his experiences earlier in the story. He's checking on Colossus, someone from a fictional marginalized group who was injured in a fight. While Johnny Storm and that one character are mackin', Rhodey scolds them for not showing urgency and helping Colossus. He says this line: "Even though they're fictional, yeah, the mutants deal with a lot of stigma in the story from the other characters, so it's cool to see Rhodey looking out for the mutants. Marvel put the event out, it sold well, so what do these companies do? They keep pushing events in this never-ending cycle. Print them greenbacks, baby!" For those who are new to my channel, mainstream comics crossovers will never appeal to me. The only event I've actually liked is the 2015 Secret Wars, which I've talked about. Otherwise, events usually feel so forced where I prefer the character development that unfolds in main series, even though those stories are still cyclical. I do these videos because I don't appreciate the gatekeeping mindset, so if this is a story that gets someone to read comics, I have no right to take that away from them. I just like comics and making videos, not here telling people to not read something. I always say to read something for yourself because you're the best judge of what you'll like.
What can I tell you? I never thought it would go the distance, so here it is, 40 years later, we're still talking about it? That surprises me.
Layton departed the book for a while, however he would occasionally do covers. In issue 215 he returned to the series with Michelinie. The icon himself, Mark Bright, was the regular penciler during this era, so Tony is still rocking the Silver Centurion armor. Another key member of this creative team is letterer Janice Chiang. Issues 215 to 224 lean heavily into corporate sabotage, especially with the appearance of the Ghost, an anti-corporate saboteur who targets Tony. Tony is close to financial ruin by this point anyway. Ghost is such a fascinating character because he's like Tony, a former corporate head, but instead of going the superhero route, he gets paid to bring down companies. Issues 225 to 232 feature Armor Wars, one of Iron Man's most character-defining stories. It features Tony going up against villains and heroes who are using his stolen technology. I love this story, though it can be a bit drawn out, but it's everything Tony's been dealing with building up to this. Going back to the 60s, facing off against other Iron Men, Hammer hacking his suit to assassinate a diplomat, his battles with alcohol and fear of even putting a suit back on. Tony doesn't want others to be harmed because of something he created. It shows how Tony is willing to go to extremes to prevent any more people from getting hurt. He ends up losing some people in the process. I'm taking a moment to cover Janice Chiang's work. The entire team during the second run is pretty consistent. Born to Chinese immigrants in New York in 1955, Chiang gravitated to the fine arts. According to Chiang, before comics, she learned calligraphy from her father. This is apparent looking at the lettering in her text boxes. Paying attention to her lettering in these Iron Man stories, every gunshot or explosion sounds different. It's all of these small details that complement the story. There was very little cultural representation for people from marginalized groups during that time, so the fact that she's entering the industry in the 70s, working on all these titles, and leaving her mark is so cool to see. She's still making comics. Her sister Faye was a poet, artist, and activist who pushed for inclusiveness of other cultures in New York, especially Asian Americans. Joe Rosen, the Iron Man letterer at the start of the decade, and Rick Parker, the letterer during O'Neill's run, brought their own flavors to the book. I just think Chiang's story is fascinating. Her style is the most distinctive. When Bright departs the series after Armor Wars, Butch Guice takes over as series penciler, with Layton doing finishes. After Guice, Layton takes over doing pencils and inks until his valiant departure.
No, Butch and I we worked on a lot of stuff for a lot of years at Marvel, and he used to crash in my apartment because I lived 3 blocks from the office. So he would come from North Carolina and crash on the couch when he came to New York. No, we were buddies. I mean, I just talked to him 6 months before he died. I had no idea he was sick. He didn't let me know either, but yeah, I took that one pretty hard because he was considerably younger than me.
This last run dives into the dangers of Tony's life as a public figure. He deals with a constant stream of enemies and the government wanting to take his work, also dealing with dangerous groupies. Let's end this run on a high note. Issues 249 to 250 see a reunion between Victor Von Doom and Tony Stark. The highlights of these stories are Doom and Iron Man bickering with each other. They're summoned by the wizard Merlin to save Camelot in the future. It's the year 2093, a time of convenience, consumerism, and excess. Victor and Tony both meet the Iron Man and Doom of the future. Doom sees himself and is disappointed by the warped mechanical being he becomes. Even though Iron Man fights his descendant, a lot of this story focuses on Dr. Doom and his humanity. He resents his future self for sacrificing his humanity to rule over a soulless corporate commercialist future. He's pushing for his autonomy and wants to prevent this future from happening. There are a few issues after 250 by Dwayne McDuffie, however the character-defining Michelinie and Layton run ends here.
Oriented. Tony is the most human of all superheroes besides Batman. For one reason, that he relies on technology. You buy the technology, the whole thing works. It's as simple as that. The point of it is, it's next-gen tech. And all you have to do is buy that, just like with James Bond. Well, the reason why James Bond resonated with my generation, like Goldfinger and Thunderball and You Only Live Twice, was the technology was within reach. And as long as you don't stretch your credibility, it reaches a wider audience. And Tony is somebody who, like ourselves, is incredibly vulnerable and flawed. And we kind of like that in our heroes, the characters that aren't totally pristine.
Some of these are going to be from the 70s, but they're still part of the Michelinie and Layton run. Number 126, Tony Stark vs. Justin Hammer. Aside from the iconic Romita and Layton cover, this shows Tony's ingenuity without the suit. If you ever want to see what Tony Stark can do with a jug of water, a belt buckle, and a lamp, read this issue. Number 128, The Demon in a Bottle issue. No supervillain, no big event, just Tony working on his own issues. It sets the stage for a darker Iron Man story that comes later. There are some letters from readers in subsequent issues talking about this story's impact on them. Issue 141. It takes place during a vacation storyline and isn't a key issue. However, it's well drawn and written. It features the return of Justin Hammer, who is as much of a menace as ever. There are some creative fight scenes, Iron Man uses shadow clones, Bethany Cape takes down some bad guys, Hammer mentions how he's willing to do anything to get ahead, unlike Tony. It's also Romita's return to the series after some time off the book. Issue 144, How I Met Your Tony, the story of how Rhodey helped Tony escape Vietnam. It's the immediate follow-up to Tales of Suspense 39. Also recommending this one because it's a more updated retelling of the classic origin without the xenophobic depictions of Southeast Asian people from the original story. The retcon is cool to see, showing how Rhodey has been around since the beginning. Tony and Rhodey shooting the breeze is worth the price of admission. Issue 150, Doomquest. A modern knight and evil wizard go to Camelot. Nuff said. Number 218, the first appearance of the undersea armor. Layton and Michelinie tie a new armor to the real-life search for the Titanic. Stark's company was involved in the search for the wreck. It's revealed that the ship was carrying some dangerous chemicals, so Tony retrieves them before others can. The real wreck was discovered in 1985 and the story released in 1987, but it's a cool way to connect fiction and real-world events. It also features Tony's favorite pastime, giving people second chances. Issue 220, Ghost vs. Spymaster. This is a lead up to the Armor Wars story, and Tony is a third wheel in this issue. Michelinie, Bright, and Layton put two Iron Man villains with the most personality into one story. Corporate sabotage, villains fighting, Tony putting on the old suit even though he hates it because it reminds him of his past. This issue also brings up how Rhodey is tired of Tony forcing the suit on him. Great issue though. Issue 225, the start of Armor Wars. The story that shows how far Tony is willing to go to stop his technology from falling into the wrong hands. After trying to make up for a life of mistakes, Tony's technology is still used to harm people. There's a moment where Tony takes out his frustration on the military-industrial complex. Also, whenever Scott Lang makes an appearance, it's a win. Iron Man Crash. This isn't even part of the main series. It's a graphic novel from Marvel's Epic Comics imprint. This comic is described as the first computer-generated graphic novel. It's a story told using early CGI that leans into cyberpunk. Tony ends up building an Iron Man suit that gains free will. In the back of the book, Mike Sands covers his process making this project on a Mac 2. Cyberpunk Iron Man with a shotgun in Japan sounds like a bootleg comic, but Archie Goodwin himself approved this. Issue 232. This one is the epilogue to Armor Wars, but I'm putting this here out of my appreciation for Barry Windsor Smith's art. He's inked by Layton, and Michelinie is still co-writing. The issue is a nightmare sequence that can be read on its own, focusing on Tony's guilt at manufacturing weapons and wondering if his guilt could still be used to harm people after Armor Wars, giving you some of that Tetsuo the Iron Man flavor, showing Tony dealing with his fear that he might be more machine than man. I appreciate Bob Layton for taking the time to do this interview about his Iron Man run. For people who don't agree with my takes, don't take it out on Layton, he just showed up for an interview. This era took Tony from a guy in a metal suit doing random superhero stuff to a layered character dealing with guilt and using technology to make the future happen sooner. Also, it's one of my favorite eras for the character. So, the scholars watching this realize that I removed a major chunk of the 80s. The Denny O'Neil Iron Man run is a highlight for the character. It shows Tony at his lowest before his redemption with one of my favorite moments in the entire series. That run deserves its own video, which means I'm splitting this decade into 2 parts. Everyone's information is in the description, website is witsendpod.com. That's where people can find my essays and transcripts. Patreon is for BTS and exclusive material. If it's not on my site, it's a knockoff. Share these essays around. Thanks very much for checking out my work. Chaos ensues.